This is The Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joseph Cohen from Queens College in the City University of New York. For more, visit theannexpodcast.com. And now we turn to Amy Binder from the University of California, San Diego. Amy is the author of Becoming Right: How Campuses Shape Conservatives, published by Princeton University Press. It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us, Amy.
Well, thank you for having me.
Amy, can you tell us about Becoming Right? What's the book about, and what are the big insights?
Well, this book was published 5 years ago, so in some ways it feels like old news. On the other hand, I'd like to think that there are some lessons in here that are useful today. Basically, the reason why I wanted to write this book was because back in 2006, 2007, when I began thinking about it, there was a lot of critique coming out that you were hearing in the media, that you were hearing from some conservative organizations about how campuses were indoctrinating liberal bastions of pampered intellectuals.
Yes.
So David Horowitz was coming up with the Academic Bill of Rights. He was doing that. He had written a book called The Most Dangerous Professors in the Land. There are a bunch of other books coming out. So I was fascinated by this discourse and wanted to know what students themselves were experiencing on campus and even what they thought about these critiques. So I decided to look at this qualitatively and to do a comparative case study of two campuses, one a private elite university on the East Coast and one a public flagship university in the interior West. Basically I wanted to see what conservative students were thinking about kind of ideologically, what their issue positions were, how they were experiencing faculty and their peers on these campuses, what kinds of events they held, what kinds of future positions in politics or policy or what have you they were planning. And so I went about doing interviews with these students.
And what were the big differences that you saw between the Northeastern elite college Republican and the Western flagship Republican?
This was just an unanticipated finding, actually, kind of the blockbuster finding of the book, if you will. And basically, the thing that we found in common with these schools was that the students on each of the campuses more or less held the same ideological orientations. They were all for low taxes, small government, national security. They were almost all of a mind about even the social issues, which I was a little surprised about, because in the West, there's more of a libertarian flavor. But, most people were against abortion and so on. But the real differences were in how they thought about the types of events that they wanted to put on their campus and just kind of the disposition of what it meant to be conservative. So on the West Campus, there was a real impulse to have a lot of fun, put on events that would really poke liberals in the eye, get them to respond in a very kind of aggressive way.
Like what?
What's now become pretty widely appreciated as the affirmative action bake sale. Sometimes these are now called the social justice bake sales. What you do is you'd set up a stand to sell cookies to folks on campus. And if you're a white person coming to buy a cookie from the stand, then you would pay $2 for your cookie. But if you're a Black student, you would pay 25 cents. And the idea was that this was a great illustration of how whites are discriminated against on campus. And these were, incredibly confrontational. Liberal students, Black students, other types of students did not like these affirmative action bake sales, and they tended to attract a lot of media attention. Administrators got involved, so they became these big cause célèbre on campus. Catch an Illegal Alien Day, Animal Appreciation Barbecue, things that meant to kind of slay the sacred cows of the left, and highly provocative, really confrontational. On the East Coast campus, we found, and when I say we, I mean my co-author Kate Wood and I, found that conservatives knew about these kinds of events at Western and other campuses. They thought that they would be fun to hold. They understood the allure of them. They knew that national conservative organizations were sponsoring them, but the Eastern students felt like they could not possibly hold an event like this on their campus. It was not becoming to students such as themselves, students with great futures. They were concerned about what that would look like on their resume in their future. They didn't want to attract media attention. They were much more interested in having good discussions with people on campus who didn't necessarily agree with them, try to get their conservative points across. And really, they just thought that this did not fit with their kind of orientation.
So I'm just going to interject. This was clearly not Columbia's campus, because I can recall Columbia hosting at least a few affirmative action bake sales.
Yeah, it was not Columbia. And what were the years that you heard about
I think
these?
there were 2 years in a row while I was still in grad school.
Mm-hmm.
So
Bush years.
Probably, Bush years. I'm pretty sure. Yep.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Columbia is an interesting campus, and they have quite a I guess, more confrontational college Republicans. I mean, this is also something that you wouldn't necessarily expect to happen at Berkeley, which is, one of the flagship campuses in the UC system, not the one that we studied for Western. But at some of these schools, the college Republicans, at some of the most identifiably liberal schools, the college Republicans, they have some of the largest numbers of any other universities in the U.S. and Columbia may be like that.
What does account for the difference? Why are the Western flagship Republicans different from the Eastern elites?
So, one really important point to get across is that we do not think that college Republicans and associated conservative groups are home at the Western campus, are home to students who are less smart than those at Eastern Elite. They're very savvy. They're very strategic. This isn't about just, folks who are indoctrinated into Fox News and are unthinking or anything like that. I mean, they're really thinking a lot about what kinds of events they want to have. So we looked elsewhere beyond just kind of individual talents, and what we found was that it was the culture and the organizational arrangements on campus that led these people to thinking about themselves as conservatives in very different ways. And what I mean by that is, at Eastern Elite, 100% of students live on campus, or virtually every student lives on campus all 4 years. They have smaller class sizes, so they get to know faculty better. They get to know their classmates better. They talk about faculty in a different way as world-class experts, as people who would not try to politicize their classrooms because they were consummate, knowledge producers and so forth. So there is a lot more of a sense of trust, closeness, solidarity. Doesn't mean they agreed with everybody on campus, but there was a kind of collective we-ness that built up at Eastern. And we think that really militated against doing something that would be seen as inappropriate. Whereas at Western flagship, it's a much bigger school. A lot more people live off campus. They go to classes where there are a lot more students per faculty. Faculty might be seen as, a distant figure up there. So there is a lot more anonymity and, a sense of maybe enemy in a way. And this led, we think, students to feel like hey, what the hell? We can do whatever we want. It's worth it to have fun. We're college kids. Why not just kind of go big, get the media? This is going to serve us well. So there are a bunch of different factors there. I realize that I just named, but it was the real feeling of the campus that differed in these cases. And maybe this explains Columbia as well, in a way, that Columbia is a campus that does not have that kind of community bubble feeling nearly so much. It's in the middle of New York. Probably more students living off campus, doing their own thing. It's just a guess, but it may fit in.
What do you think of this idea that colleges are indoctrinating young people into liberalism? You hear it a lot in the right, as you said. Do you think there is some substance, maybe not entirely true, but do you think that at the very least colleges are serving conservative students poorly?
I'm not convinced that we are serving conservative students well, but I wouldn't say it's because we are indoctrinating them. I mean, one of the really interesting findings that we had with students across both campuses was that conservative students were almost to a person convinced that they were getting better educations in college than their liberal classmates were. They thought that it was very useful to them to have to hone their arguments, to really sharpen their debating skills because so many people around them were liberal. And they really thought that liberal students were quite complacent because the liberal students had a sense that faculty agreed with them. I do think that liberal faculty or faculty in general can do a better job of not being complacent themselves and thinking that all of their students in their classroom must be liberal because that's what smart people are. We heard complaints about this from the conservative students too, that even if faculty weren't kind of egregiously saying nasty things about George W. Bush, who was president at the time we were doing most of our interviews. They were making the assumption that, if people were in my class and got into college, then they must fall somewhere on the liberal side. So I think that we can do more to support conservative students. And I personally am committed to doing that on my campus.
With this issue of conservative students feeling that they're getting a better education because they both have to basically see the text and the subtext, or, the argument, the counter argument. I've noticed this a lot, not so much from the students, but you'll sometimes hear people make this argument that because mainstream discourse is dominated by the center left, anyone who opposes that, whether it's from the center right or the far left, kind of has to understand both the mainstream perspective and their counter narrative. In a way, it kind of reminds me of the theory of dual consciousness. Not to kind of trivialize the difference of race versus the achieved difference of political disagreement. But, there is this idea that if there is a mainstream, whatever that mainstream may be, that kind of has hegemonic power, then anyone who's in opposition to that has to understand it on its own terms as well as understand the opposition to it. In some ways, they may even understand the mainstream position better than somebody who takes it unquestioningly.
Totally agree. I totally agree with that, Gabriel. I don't know if you're aware of this, but, I am a person of color.
Well, it's been a while since we've seen each other face to face.
And I'm also a woman, right? I'm also a woman.
Okay, now you're shocking.
I know. And yeah, I mean, it's always so interesting to hear conversations about campus politics and, and the liberal leanings of campus faculty, because, all throughout my academic career, like, in undergrad and also in graduate school, I was always shocked at how not progressive my professors were, right? And I think a lot of it was because of my standpoint and where I stood. And I actually did think, this is a text and this is a subtext, and this is how I have to work through this. And at the same time, on my campus as well, and I'm sure across the country, ever since the election of Trump, there have been many people saying that, we need to be able to protect conservative students, that now the very same conservative students who poo-pooed safe spaces for students during the Obama era were now actually asking for safe spaces themselves in order to be able to support Trump and be very vocal in that support. I'm wondering, calling, certain students snowflakes, but now themselves, turning into snowflakes. So I'm wondering whether or not any of you are experiencing this on your campuses.
Well, before you get into that, I totally agree with what you're saying about safe spaces. It's weird because people reject the specific language as kind of the tribal markers of the opposition who they define themselves against. Mm-hmm. But if you just change the names, concepts like safe spaces, microaggressions, snowflakes, all that sort of stuff has precise parallels side to side, right? This idea of you need a place where you can be amongst people who sympathize with you and aren't going to criticize you and aren't going to make you feel uncomfortable. The idea that people not so much deliberately insulting you, but just having a different set of assumptions that reflect the hegemony of their side or their identity. You see that reflected. The idea that would somehow be a form of aggression in a minor way. I mean, that's basically just microaggressions, but if you take a different version of it without the name, a lot of the complaints you see from the right on campus are basically center on that. The idea that it's hard to be in a minority and deal with people having different assumptions than you. All these types of things. And then on top of that, you also have this issue on both sides that the very people who most want safe spaces and that sort of thing can also be the most belligerent about and provocative to the other side, right? It's the people who most have, whether it's from kind of the left or right, the people who are most about, it's not fair for people to make me feel uncomfortable are the ones who can be the most belligerent. Just finally, you have this issue of it's a form of identity politics, and I think this is particularly true in the Trump era where the right kind of take on full-fledged identity politics and the idea that it's an identity, regardless of whether it's a mere political identity or whether it's an identity associated with, white people or native-born Americans or whatever. There's much more of a pure visceral, this is our side, this is their side, and it's less ideological per se and much more about tribalism.
So on the issue of safe spaces, this was actually something that was coming up already, not in nomenclature exactly, but 8 years ago when I was collecting these data, conservatives were talking about this, and they saw their clubs as being places where it would be a place where they could go and they could just kind of experience some relief from not having to constantly argue their side, and there would be some understanding among people. But there were also places, interestingly enough, where a lot of rumors got started. So some of the kind of urban legends about this professor was grading poorly if you had conservative ideas on your paper. These kinds of stories would start getting passed around as well. So there was a lot of solidarity in these spaces, but also we saw them as places where these kinds of stories about not myself. I didn't experience a whole lot of red on my paper. I didn't get the non-passing grade, but I know somebody else who told me somebody else did. So these pockets of solidarity.
So am I getting this right? Am I hearing that even back then, that as conservatives and conservative students in particular were poo-pooing the sort of, the sort of discourse around safe spaces that women, students of color, trans students, etc., were sort of pushing for on their college campuses, that these students at the same exact time understood for themselves the value of their clubs as a safe space?
Way back then, there's a lot of borrowing, adopting the discourses and language of multiculturalism, diversity of viewpoints, and so on. I would be hard pressed to remember if they called these, their club safe spaces per se. But that's absolutely the way that they were thinking about these things. And, we had a student on the Western flagship campus who straight up said, Black students, and let's recall on this campus, Black students made up maybe 5% of the student population. But Black students are fortunate. They have clubs that support them. And it's really the Christian white male on this campus who is the most vilified and suffers the most. So this discourse goes back
I love it.
quite a ways, and it's been. This isn't just the work of 20-somethings on these campuses. There are national conservative organizations like Young America's Foundation, Leadership Institute, that have been actively promoting these ways of understanding one's experience. And in some ways, students adopt, some of those arguments from the national organizations. In other ways, they see their lives differently. But there has really been this coordinated effort to get students to think like this.
I have a question. One thing that I learned from Gabriel's whole experience with the Milo Yiannopoulos invitation at UCLA is it really pressed upon me the value of mentoring conservative students. I think a lot of us, I think a lot of scholars who are liberal in their leaning, their first reaction when they meet a conservative student is to try to proselytize. With this whole incident with Milo at UCLA, it really impressed on me the need that students have to get mentorship in navigating the advancement of their own views in the public sphere and how to do that effectively. What are your views on that? Like, do left-leaning professors, do you think we have an obligation to help mentor conservative students even if we don't agree with their political views? Or is it something that they don't need? There's others who can do the job well.
Well, I think all students need to be mentored, and particularly on campuses like mine, which is a large University of California campus, and to kind of counter the feelings of isolation or alienation, it's really best if adults and particularly faculty can talk with all students, and particularly those who are feeling most at odds with the campus, whether those are students of color or students who are conservative or what have you. I think it's really important for faculty, and this is not a controversial statement, but to not go into their classrooms and make fun of President Trump, to not do things that are, just baldly political, and or to have, Obama posters in their offices where students come to office hours. I personally think that that's really important. I think that can go a long way to making conservative students feel more at home. I don't know that I would say that any of the faculty I know try to proselytize to students. I think we try to if we're teaching about inequality, it's hard not to talk about particular kinds of policies. And, a lot of the policies that we think work happen to be the policies of more liberal administrations or actors. But to me, that doesn't seem like proselytizing. Do
you think that it would be perceived as such? Like that's the rub, right? Like, to one person, it might be obvious that global warming is happening or that cutting taxes on the rich won't create middle-class jobs. But to say that is to advance what is seen as a liberal party line. And how do you walk that line?
Well, so one of the things that I've thought quite a bit about is how faculty can render their expert knowledge in their classrooms, but then make students feel like it is their floor as well to participate in classroom discussions, and also to kind of open up encourage students to come to office hours to talk about these issues in private if they don't want to kind of out themselves as being outliers in the class. But just to kind of underscore that I'm here to listen to their ideas as well, and that these are open for discussion.
Yeah. So a minute ago, you said that you don't think it's controversial that professors shouldn't proselytize, blah blah blah. But I actually disagree with that. I think it is not that I disagree on the merits. I agree with you normatively, but in terms of describing how people feel about it, I disagree with that. It's not consistent with what I've observed, right? So it's like after the election, there was an enormous amount of stuff on Twitter and blogs and email listservs and, saying like, how do we talk to our students about the trauma of just having gone through this election, which presumes that the students subjectively perceived it as traumatic, right? That they disagreed with it and they saw it as grievous. Whereas, you didn't hear those kind of conversations, definitely not in sociology departments after, Obama was reelected in 2012 or something like that, right? You don't have this idea that it's traumatic. And then even aside from kind of electoral politics, around the time that we're all writing our syllabi, so like, late summer, you'll see like these tweets that get like a million retweets with like, here's a link with my blog post on how to get through to students who, are resistant to critical perspectives on society. And when people talk about that, I think that they are talking about specific empirical findings that are good science and that students very often reject because they're not comfortable with them. So I think that there probably are a lot of students where if you try and lecture on like Pager, that the students will say, oh, that can't be, right? Maybe 50 years ago that was true, but I don't believe it. But, it's good science and they should believe it because it's good science. But I don't think that people are anguishing over how to get their students to believe McClanahan and Sandifer, right? I think people are anguishing over how to get students to accept findings that support their own ideological positions and are more or less indifferent to whether or not students accept findings that are a little more uncomfortable for their ideological positions if they even teach those findings at all.
Oh, well,
anyway,
so, I mean, what I was going to say is, I don't know. I think your example of the trauma of the election, for example, need not be a partisan one. I mean, I have conservative students here who were traumatized during and after the election as well, right?
Well, I was too, but listen, I'm one of the 3% of Republicans who voted for McMullen, and I recognize that 97% of the party stuck to the party, right? I mean, so it's like, yes, I accept that there were conservatives, Republicans, whatever, who were extremely unhappy with the election. Because I'm one of them, but I just recognize in general, there's a lot of people out there that saying if you were traumatized by the election, this is a safe space to come talk to you. Here's my safety pin on my lapel, whatever. And I'm going to have a lecture about it. It's implicitly saying this is a hostile thing and these are wrong ideas and everything like that. And I'm saying that even though I kind of sympathize with that.
To that point, I have students who voted for Trump who were traumatized by the election, right? And also traumatized by the ensuing reaction to Trump's victory, right? And so I think there was a lot of trauma to go around, right? So to that point, and all for totally different reasons, right? I mean, I'm here in DC, and and kind of the sort of the tradition here is, when your person wins, like the students here run to the White House, right, to celebrate, right? And I had students who voted for Trump who felt like, oh, like we didn't feel like we could do that. We didn't feel like we could have that moment. That was so unfair. I was saying there's lots of trauma to go around.
No, I agree with that, but I'm just saying the kinds of things I saw of people saying, how do we help our students react to the election and process it? They didn't have that in mind. They had in mind people who disliked the election because they wanted the other person to win. And kind of presumptively that's saying that, the university as an institution, your professor, whatever, is, not just in their personal life when they go home, but kind of, ex cathedra is taking a political position.
I think that the position that we all find ourselves in as citizens and, as faculty, is one of a lot of navigating these days. So, on the one hand, you want to signal to your students that you understand that there was shock after the election. I know that I did that with a small group of students who wanted to come in and talk with me. More on the liberal side, and I think you also have to kind of go into your classrooms and try to set the tone from the first class on. We're going to be talking about some controversial things today, or maybe not controversial, but things that people will disagree with. And here are some standard rules for how we're going to engage in our classroom. And by the way, if you'd like to come talk with me about your College Republican Club, please do so in office hours. And if you'd like to talk with me about something else, please do so. My office hours are in a small group. I think we're trying to hit a lot of different constituencies right now, and we should be pretty agile about this. We're smart. We may have been somewhat complacent until now, but we can. I think that we can find a stride here.
Well, normatively, that sounds great, and I'd like to see everybody do exactly what you're describing, to the extent that, or just say out entirely. But I think what you're saying is ideal. I just was disagreeing with the idea that it's uncontroversial to kind of keep politics out of lecturing.
Right. Well, and then besides that issue of keeping politics out of lecturing, I think it's also really interesting when you run into a faculty member who had not previously really talked with students on the right. And once they do, there's often a bit of an epiphany of, oh, wow, these students are really thinking about the issues, or, they're really crafting their arguments quite carefully. And I have a lot of respect for that. So, I just think that there are lots of side benefits of trying to meet people in smaller groups, not think of our jobs just as being lecturers and in the classroom, but also as people who are available to students to come and talk to.
You know what else I got from your book and from Gabriel's story is that it's a very big ask to ask somebody to switch party affiliations. Like you're asking people to turn their backs maybe on their families, on their hometown, on their faith, a lot of things. And maybe this whole idea that everything has to be, that politics has to be a team sport is what's misguiding us. And if we can help move Republicans towards sensible policy discussions, well, then it's a win for center-left people who also want sensible policy. And then neither side has to pander to the extremes of their own side.
Yeah, well, clearly we're seeing that in the populace at large, that Democrat and Republican has become much more of an identity, right? I mean, the policies are so bundled with identity these days, and the boundaries between them and the hatred of the other side and all of that. But to your point about getting students to think carefully about policies, I've been attending College Republican group meetings here, and I have been absolutely fascinated, floored, and impressed at how seriously they're talking about the issues. And in fact, tonight I'm going to a College Republicans and Democrats debate, and I expect to see really good thinking by these leaders of these clubs. Now, these are the most active people on campus, not the run-of-the-mill Republicans or Democrats, folks who are interested in political futures and so on. But if they can convince others to really delve in and not just wear their party affiliation as an identity, but to really think about issues, we'll be in good shape.
You've been listening to The Annex, a sociology podcast. For more information, visit theannexpodcast.com. Music is by Lena Orsa. Our production team included Anika Chowdhury and Liseth Moreno. On behalf of the Annex team, I'm Joe Cohen. Thanks for listening.